Welcome back, guys. Today we're going to be going through basically a second video of what we did yesterday when cleaning up the mine.get. I was asked a question, with so many simple changes between the templates, why couldn't we just figure out a different way where we don't need to have two files rather than one? And technically, it's right, you don't. And I mentioned two ways. There's actually a third way. The first way I mentioned is if you use a Python application, you can go ahead and import directly on the Salt client. The second way was using Jinja. The third way is to pass the variables directly from the file.managed declaration into the file. And let me show you an example of that. So over here, we're going to have our index.html and we have our development index.html. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and render our development index.html pretty much useless. And then we're going to rewrite the actual index.html to be, self-sufficient. So we don't have to write this web01:0. It'll automatically be passed over. So let's go ahead and do that. And we'll need to test this out with our production instance. So over here it says if development ingrains role, use the development file, else use this file, which is fine. That works perfectly fine. If you have like a large amount of changes between development and production, where you would need to include many different libraries for either or, I still recommend having two files. But if you're just doing like minor changes with variables here and there, and it's not too big of a change, it's a few lines, then you can use this next method I'm about to show you. So what we would do is we would have the same index.html declaration or something similar, and so file managed, everything will be the same basically. And the only thing that's going to be different is we're going to add one extra, or actually two extra fields to it. And we're going to include the one we will use in production. So we're going to include our source. Our source is going to be the production one. So it's going to be index.html. Templates, index.html, and so now we're gonna have this defaults category, or sorry, not category, just defaults parameter, and this is where we set the default variables. So we will say that web01 IP is going to be what the value of this was. So let's get the whole thing. Web01 IP is going to be that plus the key and the index, not the index, sorry. Well, yeah, the index value. So we'll get that. Web01 and 0. Now that will go ahead and set web01 IP. So all we'll need to do is we'll need to just go ahead and call web01 here. So we'll just change this to web01, or is it web01 IP? I think it's web01 IP that I state on the init.sls. Yeah, web01 IP. Okay, and that's the default. Now here we can have some conditional. Oh, by the way, before I continue, there are 4 spaces after the default and the defaults parameter. So sorry, between the defaults parameter and the actual variable that we're creating to pass on. That 4 spaces is important. Please don't mistake that. So if we don't have, if it's not, now, so this is where we create the conditions. So we can have, say stuff like, oops, if development ingrains role, Then we'll have context IP is equal to, we'll say it's just 2222, right? And then we'll pass that on here as 2222. We'll save this and we'll save this. Oh, we'll also need to do end if, obviously. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and remove these two. Actually, I'll just remove them, because if I try to comment them out, I have to do special comments for the Jinja, and I'm not gonna be willing to do that just right as of yet. So I'm just gonna go ahead and remove them. And then I will push this, or sorry, I will test this in Kitchen Converge now. And then we will test it out in our actual server. So let's do a Kitchen Converge. And I'll be back when this is fully converged. Okay, so it did work. I did have to fix one thing, is that I switched my logic out. So basically saying that if development not in grains.role, then put out the production IP. However, by default, it's going to use the default development one. So that way, in this sort of method, I actually don't need this development index.html. And I can just go ahead and remove this file. Now, I still keep in mind is that if there's a large number of changes, you want to have two files. But if there aren't a large number of changes, then by all means, you can just go ahead and use this method where you're passing on the variables directly from the file.managed declaration. And we can do the same thing here. So instead of using this Jinja, we can pass that on into the file.managed for the Flask application as well. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. So here where we have the two files, I'm going to go ahead and copy this one, or sorry, the production one. So let me go ahead and copy this, and then we'll pass the variables over. So defaults, and if it's development, then we want the web01 IP to be 2.2.2.2. And let's say if development not in grains role, then set the context web01 IP to whatever it is supposed to be here. And notice that I'm using double curly braces, not the curly brace percent sign, is because when you're using the curly brace percent sign, you're actually setting something. When you're not using the curly brace percent sign, you're actually calling a variable, calling a method, or so on. And that's typical Jinja. So if you know your Jinja, then you probably already know that. Other than that, let's see. So that's all I believe we should need. And let's go ahead and get the key and the index number here as well. So if it fails in one place, it fails in both places. And then we can just go ahead and refactor both. And we can save this by removing that and removing this, as well as removing yep, that can go as well. And remember, this needs to stay as string interpolated curly braces, because that's what it's calling, and that's going to be passed from the declaration as well. So now I can go ahead and get rid of these two, and that clears up a lot of our code. And we don't have to worry about it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and save this, and I'm going to go ahead and rerun convergence. And then once we're okay with both files, we're going to go ahead and start up our servers and push this into our production and see if it follows through. So it should pick up web01 IP from production, which is something other than 2.2.2.2. Okay, so let's go ahead and rerun convergence. And again, I'll go ahead and pause here and start back up when it's completed. Okay, so it succeeded. I did have another hiccup. It's a minor hiccup. I said that it was web01 IPs web01 underscore IP is equal to salt this. You don't need to do that. That's this variable here, just like how we have it in our init.sls for Apache. And it did work. So as we can see, it restarted the application and it removed these. And we should be able to go into it and see the same exact thing in our app.py. So let's go ahead and do a kitchen login. And let's go to Flask app. And I might need to be sudo. And as you see it here, it says hello from Salt, and then it puts in 2222, even though technically the variable or anything for 2222 is not anywhere in the file. It's being passed in from Jinja, which is actually quite awesome. I kind of like that. I don't use that very much because I don't support Python application anymore, but that is a very, very powerful tool. So again, we can use this method if we're making small changes here and there. If we're not making small changes and there's going to be like a huge difference between the two files, it's probably better to have two actual files, and then in context of both files with the file.managed declaration, use context and defaults to set the variables directly from the file.managed declaration rather than on the template itself. Because when you're starting to pull or have like sets and whatnot from the actual template that you're declaring, it gets a little cumbersome, and then you sort of have to look in between the lines of what's going on all in one file. Where if you clean it up with the file.manage, you can have a split pane window, and then you can have exactly what's going on or what's being declared on one side, and then what it should be reading as on the other side. And that's a very powerful tool when you can look at both things at the same time rather than scrolling up and down to find the declaration and so on. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I know I said that I would be going back into test intro, but I wanted to make sure that, you know, all of that, like, we cover all bases in terms of cleaning up our mind.get and how we would go about doing that. I'm going to split this video up into 3 videos instead of just 2. So in the next video, we're going to go ahead and push this into production, and then go ahead and see if this is able to pick up the IP for web01, and if it is, then it's a huge success. If not, we'll go ahead and troubleshoot and find out what happened and go from there. All right, so I'll see you guys in the next video.